The hallway smelled like lemon cleaner and old carpet, the kind of scent that clings to your throat and makes every breath feel borrowed. Room 412 glowed in weak brass numbers at the end of the corridor, and in my palm, a hotel keycard warmed under my fingers as if it had a pulse of its own. I heard a woman's laugh through the doorlight, confident a laugh I had known at baby showers and backyard barbecues, then a man's voice low in reply. I didn't need to see faces to know them. It takes years to recognize someone's footsteps, but it takes only one lie to know them in the dark. Somewhere behind that lock, a story I had trusted was being rewritten, without me, line by line. I pressed my temple to the cool frame and counted my breaths like I ask my anxious students to do 4 and 4 out until the shaking traveled from my hands to the floor. A red light blinked over the handle like a heartbeat I could control if I just kept still, and a thought formed with the quiet surety of a storm. I am not here to make a scene. I am here to remember everything. Before I go further, tell me where you're listening from, and if you've ever felt a truth rising in your chest before anyone said a word. Tap like and subscribe, so these stories of dignity and justice reach the people who need them most. My name is Elaine, and I grew up in a mill town off the Massachusetts Turnpike, where people minded their business and kept their promises, at least in public, and where my mother ironed our church dresses on Saturday nights, as if crisp seams could hold a family together. I met Andrew at a food drive when we were both 26. He had a nervous smile and the careful manners of a man raised to stack chairs before he left a room. We dated through snowstorms and cramped apartments, married in a small stone chapel with a leaky roof, and bought a modest colonial with a maple tree that stained our porch red each October. By the time we turned 35, we had joint savings, a calendar full of dinners with friends, and a rhythm that looked like happiness from the outside. Tessa slid into that rhythm like a favorite song someone I trusted enough to call when my father's blood pressure spiked, or when the school board cut our counseling budget and I needed a night of laughter over takeout. I come from people who hold their anger like hot tea carefully 2 hands, and never where it can spill on anyone else, which is why the first small wrongs were easy to forgive as misunderstandings. Tessa worked in public relations and always knew the new places in the city, so she started organizing couples' dinners where Andrew could talk market trends with her husband, and I could talk about freshmen who needed winter coats with her. When Mark had late site meetings, she'd stop by our house with extra cupcakes so they wouldn't go to waste, and Andrew would light the patio heaters even in March so we could sit outside, breath streaming like smoke, while we talked about everything and nothing. We all told the story of ourselves very well, a gentle, dependable quartet with smart jokes and good manners, and for a while, I let that story be true. The first shiver of wrongness didn't arrive as a scene or a confession. It arrived as a small blue dot in Andrew's leather planner, the kind he carried because he didn't trust phone reminders to show up when it mattered. He had circled the dot and written only 8, no initials, no address, nothing to anchor it to our week. And when I asked what he had that night, he said a client dinner and smiled at me like the question itself was sweet. Later, I picked up his coat to hang it, and a crushed parking stub slid to the floor with the name of a downtown hotel embossed in quiet silver. I told myself a story about valet stands and rain, about how events move locations at the last minute, and how the world is full of innocent coincidences if you're willing to believe in them. Belief is a soft chair. It lets you sit down when you need to, and sometimes you do. It was not the stub or the blue dot or even the new cologne that smelled like cedar and winter air. A scent, he said, came free with a shirt that made my chest go hollow. It was how easily those things fit together once I let them. Tessa texted me at odd hours to ask about Andrew's schedule because she wanted to plan a group surprise, and I handed over the pieces without thinking. pleased to be included in something light after so many heavy years at work. When I laughed at Andrew's story about a client who kept rescheduling, Tessa laughed too, the way women laugh when they've already heard the punchline. And then there was a Tuesday when I came home early with a stack of permission slips and saw Andrew's tie draped over the back of a dining chair, the same navy tie Tessa complimented the next day at lunch, as if she'd seen it on a person and not on a chair in my quiet house. The world does not turn on grand gestures as often as we think. It turns on small remarks that make a single scene flicker and resolve into a different picture. I stood in that hallway with the lemon cleaner and the old carpet and listened, and what I heard wasn't only laughter. It was the sound of a life rearranging itself, a half-inch to the left, where I could no longer reach it. I didn't swipe the key. I didn't knock. I folded the card in my palm until the edge pressed a clean line into my skin, and I walked back toward the elevator with my head up, watching the pattern in the carpet so I would remember it later. When the doors slid open, a woman stepped out holding a bouquet wrapped in thin paper, and for a second I smelled crushed greenery and the faint sweetness of lilies, the way a room smells at a hospital on a good day. I let the doors close and told myself the most dangerous truth I have ever chosen. This is not the moment to confront. This is the moment to begin. The night after that hallway, I sat across from Andrew at our kitchen table, my fingers resting lightly on the rim of a coffee mug that had long gone cold. He scrolled through his phone, nodding absently at something on the screen, and hummed under his breath, the way he always did when he was trying to look relaxed. His suit jacket hung on the back of the chair, and the faint trace of cologne that wasn't his usual brand clung to the fabric. I studied the line of his jaw, the casual way he bit into his toast, and felt the weight of silence press against me harder than words ever could. When he finally looked up, his smile was easy, as if nothing in his world had shifted. "Another late night tomorrow," he said, smoothing butter across bread with careful strokes. I nodded and let him believe I hadn't noticed the small lies settling between us like dust. The hardest part wasn't the suspicion itself. It was how naturally he wore it, as though deceiving me had become just another habit he carried into the house like his briefcase. My chest tightened, not from fear of what I didn't know, but from the truth I already did. That same morning, my phone lit up with a message from Tessa. She wanted to meet for brunch that weekend, just the two of us. The words blurred as I read them, her cheery tone striking me like a slap. Hours before, she had been laughing in a hotel room with my husband, and now she was sending me smiley faces and talk of mimosas. I typed back a bright, "Absolutely," and pressed send with steady hands, though my stomach churned. If she thought I would continue being the friend who nodded, listened, and forgave, she was about to learn how wrong she was. From then on, I began collecting everything. I learned to keep my expression soft, my tone light, while quietly storing every detail. I noticed how Andrew angled his phone slightly away when he set it down. How Tessa's calls always seemed to come when he was out of the room. Their arrogance left them careless. He forgot to close his laptop one evening, leaving an email thread open with hotel confirmations filed under the name of a supposed client. She once made a passing comment about Andrew's favorite tie, a detail she couldn't have known without being with him when he wore it. Each slip was a thread, and I began weaving them together into something undeniable. I kept a small black notebook tucked between recipe books in the kitchen, ordinary enough to escape attention. On its first page, I wrote one word in bold strokes: justice. Page after page filled quickly with dates, receipts, and scraps of overheard conversations. I slipped bank statements between the covers, circled restaurant charges that didn't match his stories, and copied down the times her calls came through. At night, when Andrew's breathing grew steady beside me, I stared at the ceiling and traced patterns across the plaster, my mind turning over each piece of evidence like stones in a riverbed. The pain was there, But sharper than grief was a new clarity I would not be the fool they imagined. The signs became harder to ignore. At a dinner with Andrew's colleagues, I noticed the way his eyes flicked to Tessa. When he made a careless joke about being already taken, she pretended to check her phone, but the small smile tugging at her lips betrayed her. To anyone else, it was nothing a fleeting glance between friends. To me, it was confirmation a silent conversation carried on right in front of me. I lifted my glass, clinked it gently against his, and smiled back, as though the moment hadn't sliced me open. That night, when the house was dark, I stood before the bathroom mirror with my toothbrush dangling uselessly in my hand. My reflection looked back at me, eyes lined with exhaustion, but lit with something stronger. I whispered barely above breath, "You will not walk away from this broken." The words were not a plea. They were a vow. I felt the certainty settle into me, grounding me more firmly than any comfort I had known in years. I tested their confidence carefully. When Andrew left his phone charging in the kitchen, I picked it up with steady fingers. No passcode. He never thought I would look. Inside, Tessa's name was hidden under Tom, a poor disguise. Their messages scrolled endlessly across the screen. Flirtations, hotel arrangements, promises written with the casual boldness of people who believed they were safe. My stomach knotted as I read, but I didn't cry. Instead, I took photographs of every screen and sent them to a hidden email account I had created. One by one, the files collected like drops in a reservoir, waiting for the day the dam would break. Tessa, too, underestimated me. She came to lunch one afternoon, dressed in a tailored jacket with a smile practiced to perfection, and spoke about being exhausted from work deadlines. She sighed over her coffee, shaking her head, and I nodded with sympathy I did not feel. Each fabricated detail she shared was another gift she handed me, another record to add to my ledger of betrayal. By the time we hugged goodbye, my jaw ached from holding back the truth burning in my chest. The act of watching them turned into something colder, something more deliberate. I drove past places Andrew claimed to be and saw his car parked elsewhere. I followed them once to a quiet bar near the waterfront, where they leaned close in a shadowed booth, the low light glinting off her bracelet I had helped pick out years ago. My heart pounded, but I stayed still, letting the moment carve itself into memory. Another night, I watched them enter a hotel separately and leave together the next morning. Each observation added weight to the evidence I carried, transforming my hurt into armor. The hardest part was maintaining the mask. At family gatherings, I laughed at Andrew's stories, passed dishes to Tessa, and joined conversations as though nothing had shifted. To outsiders, we were the picture of loyalty and friendship. Inside, I was building something careful and precise. Every polite smile and every nod was a stone laid quietly on the path that would lead them exactly where I wanted them to go. By the third week, the notebook was nearly full. I had photographs, receipts, messages, and the beginnings of a plan taking shape in the margins of those pages. But I knew raw evidence wasn't enough. It wouldn't satisfy me to simply confront them and watch them deny it. I wanted them stripped bare, not only in my eyes, but in the eyes of everyone they had fooled. Their downfall needed to be complete, and it needed to be public. One evening, as Andrew dozed in his chair after dinner, I slipped quietly into the kitchen. I opened the notebook and turned to a clean page. With deliberate strokes, I wrote a single line: "They believe I am blind. I will use it." I closed the cover and slid it back into its hiding place, the faint scent of rosemary from the cookbook settling over it like a veil. My heart beat steady, not with grief this time, but with anticipation. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, knowing that the beginning of their end was already written. The days that followed were quieter, but my resolve never wavered. Each smile I gave, each conversation I carried, became part of a performance I had mastered. Andrew still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still sprawled on the couch with his laptop at night, confident in his deception. Tessa still called me sister and spoke of weekend plans, her eyes shining with false warmth. They believed they were safe, but I knew differently. The first crack had already spread too far, and the walls they built around their secret were beginning to tremble. I didn't yet know when I would reveal everything, but I knew this. The moment would come when they least expected it. Their laughter would curdle into silence, their pride into shame, and I would be standing there not as the woman they thought was naive, but as the one who had been watching all along, ready to bring the truth crashing down. I woke each morning to the sound of Andrew's alarm, the same chime that used to feel like the start of our day together. Now it carried a different weight. He would silence it quickly, dress with routine efficiency, and kiss my forehead before heading out. To anyone else, nothing seemed unusual, but I carried the knowledge of his late nights and the secrets folded inside his pocket. The kitchen smelled of his coffee, the same dark roast I had bought for years, yet each sip I took tasted bitter, soured by the lies that hung in the air between us. When he left for work, I found myself staring at the empty chair across from me, my hand resting on the mug he had just used. The ring of heat fading from the ceramic mirrored the way my faith in him was cooling. I wanted to scream to confront him, but instead, I tucked those impulses away. I knew they would serve me better later. Grief had already shown itself in the quiet hours of the night, pressing down on me until my pillow was damp with tears. But each morning, I reminded myself that tears were temporary. What I carried now was sharper, and it would guide me. Tessa's messages arrived daily, cheerful notes about lunches or weekend plans, always wrapped in the same warmth that used to comfort me. I read them differently now, aware of the deception behind each word. She invited me to her office one afternoon, saying she had something funny to share about a client. I agreed, curious to see her in her own space. Her office was polished, her laughter practiced, and she leaned across the desk as if nothing had shifted between us. But when she mentioned a tie Andrew had worn the other night, my stomach tightened. I hadn't seen that tie on him recently. Her slip of the tongue felt like confirmation carved in stone. I nodded, smiling faintly, though the air between us had turned heavy. At night, I replayed those moments alone. I thought of dinners where the three of us had sat together, wine glasses raised, and remembered the flickers of glances I once ignored. I thought of all the years of trust, of leaning on Tessa like family, and how those memories now twisted into knives. Lying in bed beside Andrew, I listened to his steady breathing while my own chest ached. I would turn toward the wall, whispering to myself words I could not yet speak aloud. You are not weak. You will not be broken. The repetition became a lifeline, a steady rhythm that kept me anchored when doubt threatened to pull me under. The hardest moments were in public, surrounded by friends or colleagues where appearances mattered most. At a gathering one evening, Andrew made a small joke about being unavailable, and his eyes darted briefly to Tessa across the table. Their smiles were fleeting but sharp enough to pierce me. I sipped my drink, nodded at his words, and let them believe I hadn't noticed. Holding my composure became both shield and strategy. I realized then that humiliation, not secrecy, would be their undoing. The thought brought with it a strange calm that surprised me. I poured myself into documenting the quiet betrayals. Each receipt I found tucked into his pockets, each charge on our account that didn't fit his story, I added to the black notebook waiting on the kitchen shelf. Its pages grew thick with evidence, a map of their arrogance and my resolve. Writing down each detail steadied me, turning pain into purpose. I discovered that the act of recording gave me control again, as though every line of ink was a step away from despair and closer to justice. One night, while Andrew showered, I unlocked his phone. My hands didn't shake. His lack of caution confirmed what I already suspected. He didn't believe I would ever look. The messages were endless, her name disguised under another contact, their conversations full of reckless boldness. My chest constricted as I read, but instead of weeping, I took photographs of every page and stored them safely. When I finished, I returned the phone to its place and walked away, knowing I carried in my hands the proof of all their lies. Tessa continued to play her role, sharing her supposed struggles with work or speaking of loneliness, all while maintaining her mask. I listened, offering nods and quiet words, though inside I catalogued every falsehood. Each story she told gave me another thread to weave into my plan. I began to see her not as a friend who had betrayed me, but as a character playing a role in a performance I was directing. My hurt slowly transformed into a cold clarity that made it easier to breathe. The weight of silence grew heavier with each day. I carried it through my work at school, guiding students through their small heartbreaks and challenges while holding my own private storm inside. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, but the thought of exposing the truth kept me upright. I knew the day would come when the silence would break, and I wanted to be ready. The image of their laughter turning to shock sustained me when the ache in my chest grew too sharp. Late one evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open before me. The house was quiet, the only sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stared at the pages filled with evidence, the neat lines of handwriting that no longer shook, and felt something shift. This wasn't just documentation anymore. It was preparation. I closed the book, slid it back into its place, and whispered again the words that had become my promise. You will not walk away broken. For the first time since the truth had begun to unravel, I felt steadiness settle over me like a cloak. The cracks in their facade were spreading, visible now, in ways I couldn't ignore. I could feel the end of their secrecy drawing closer. The time for grief was fading, and the time for action was nearing. And as I lay down to sleep, Andrew's arm heavy across my waist, I stared into the dark and knew with certainty that the moment of reckoning was no longer far away. The evening I overheard them mocking me was the night something inside me shifted forever. I had followed Andrew to another hotel, not out of impulse, but because my instincts refused to rest. The hallway smelled of stale air and overused carpet cleaner, and the muffled sounds behind the door left little to the imagination. I leaned close, steadying my breath, and then I heard Tessa laugh. Her voice was clear, carrying an ease that cut me more sharply than any scream could. Andrew's reply followed, low and certain, calling me naive, saying I would never suspect. The words struck with a force that stole my breath. For a long moment, I stood frozen, staring at the brass numbers on the door, my hand clutching the keycard. Then I felt the tears dry against my cheeks. Their mockery did not leave me broken, it solidified me. I walked away from that hotel with a strange steadiness in my chest. The city air was biting, but it cleared my head with every breath. I lit a cigarette I hadn't touched in years, inhaling deeply as the smoke curled into the February night. Each drag seemed to etch something permanent into me. Grief had done its work, but now rage had its place. I flicked the ashes into a snowbank and told myself quietly that this was not the moment to fight. It was the moment to plan. If they believed I was blind, then I would let them keep believing it until the time was right. At home, Andrew sat in his usual chair, the glow of the television washing his face in pale light. He greeted me with a smile, as if nothing in his world had shifted. I returned the gesture calm and unshaken, though my heart still echoed with the words I had heard hours earlier. He talked about a project at work, about how busy the next few weeks would be, and I listened, nodding when expected. Inside, my mind was already arranging pieces on a board they didn't know existed. For the first time since suspicion began gnawing at me, I no longer doubted myself. I had the proof I needed, and I had the resolve to use it. That night, as Andrew slept, I opened the drawer where my notebook lay hidden between recipe books. Its black cover felt heavier than before, as though it carried the weight of everything I had endured. I turned to a blank page and wrote, deliberately pressing the pen until the letters left faint impressions on the sheet beneath. They think I am naive, I will use it. Closing the book, I slipped it back into its place and lay down in the dark beside Andrew. His arm rested across my waist, warm and heavy, but it no longer anchored me. My mind replayed the moment behind that hotel door, their laughter, his dismissive tone, and I realized that this was no longer about heartbreak. It was about clarity. The next day, I carried myself differently. At work, my colleagues noticed nothing unusual, yet I felt taller, more composed. Students came to me with their troubles, and I counseled them, as always, but part of me was elsewhere sharpening. Each time Andrew texted me that he'd be late, each time Tessa sent me another cheerful message about brunch or plans, I responded with practiced ease. They saw the same wife and friend, but I knew I was something else now. I had stepped across a threshold, and there was no going back. My chance to test this new resolve came sooner than I expected. One evening, Andrew returned home with his tie askew, cheeks flushed from more than just the winter cold. He explained it away with talk of a client dinner that ran late. I smiled, setting his plate on the table, and asked nothing more. Later, while he showered, I slipped into his study and opened his laptop. He had left it unguarded, trusting me too much, and within moments, I found what I suspected. An email confirmation for a hotel stay disguised under the title of a work meeting. The date matched the night he claimed to be across town with a client. I copied the details into my notebook, the rhythm of the pen against paper calming me. When I closed the laptop and returned to the kitchen, I felt no panic, no trembling. I simply waited for the sound of water to stop, prepared to hand him a towel with steady hands and an unreadable smile. The mask became easier with each passing day. I laughed at his stories, agreed to Tessa's invitations, and played the part they believed I was destined for. But beneath it, a new strength settled. No longer did I wonder if I was imagining things or if I was at fault. Their words at the hotel had burned away every shadow of doubt. The grief that once hollowed me out was gone, replaced with something harder, something unshakable. They had mocked me for trusting them, but that trust was gone, and in its place was resolve. One night, I stood again before the bathroom mirror. My reflection looked back at me with clearer eyes, steadier shoulders, and a faint smile that carried no warmth. I whispered, "You will not walk away from this broken. You will walk away victorious." The words felt less like a vow this time, and more like a certainty. I turned off the light, leaving my reflection behind, and returned to bed with a heart no longer weighed down by sorrow. The following weekend, Tessa suggested brunch, her message full of cheerful exclamation points. I agreed, not because I wanted to sit across from her, but because I wanted to see her lies up close. At the cafe, she greeted me with her usual warmth, her arms tight around me, as though nothing stood between us. We ordered coffee, and she launched into stories about work and friends, her laughter filling the space. I listened carefully, my face composed, while her every word reminded me of the truth I carried. When she mentioned Andrew's recent schedule with casual familiarity, I smiled politely, even as her knowledge confirmed what I already knew. She believed her mask was flawless. I let her believe it. Walking home afterward, I felt the winter air sting my cheeks. The city around me carried on, unaware of the storm brewing quietly in my life. But inside, I felt a calm I hadn't known before. For the first time, I wasn't grieving or doubting. I was preparing. The realization settled into me as firmly as the ground beneath my feet. I had crossed from sorrow into resolve, and there was no turning back. The moment had arrived where silence no longer felt like weakness. It had become my greatest weapon, and soon enough, it would become their downfall. The weeks that followed carried a quiet rhythm that masked the storm building beneath it. Andrew still rose early, still buttoned his shirts with neat precision, still left the house with a kiss on my cheek that tasted of routine. To anyone watching from outside, nothing had changed, but I knew better. I had watched them, listened to them, and gathered the pieces of their lies until I no longer questioned myself. What had once been grief was now a sharpened edge, and I carried it carefully as I began the slow work of preparing their downfall. My first steps were small, almost invisible. I learned the pattern of his calendar, the way he entered meetings in neat blue ink on nights I knew he was with her. I noted each one, cross-checking them with credit card charges that matched hotel bars and restaurants across the city. Tessa's texts came in at odd hours, some innocent, others slipping with familiarity that betrayed her. I never confronted her. Instead, I smiled, laughed when she expected me to, and tucked her words away like stones I was collecting for a wall she would eventually have to face. Their confidence in my silence gave me all the cover I needed. I began building more than just notes. I wanted eyes where I could not always be. I reached out quietly to someone I trusted, an old friend named Ethan, who now worked as a photographer. He didn't ask many questions when I explained that I needed a discreet camera for personal reasons. He handed me a small device that could be hidden easily, no larger than my thumb, and promised it would give me a clear view. I thanked him, slipping it into my coat pocket, knowing he had given me exactly what I needed to set the trap. The next time Andrew scheduled a conference, I studied his email until I found the hotel confirmation buried in a folder he assumed I would never touch. The dates aligned perfectly with one of his secret meetings. I booked a room beside theirs, using a different name, paying carefully so no trail could lead back to me. The night arrived cold and clear, the kind of evening where the city air stung your skin but kept you alert. I watched them from across the lobby as they checked in separately, pretending caution, though their closeness betrayed them. I followed minutes later, quiet, composed, the camera tucked safely in my purse. Inside the room, I sat in the dark with only the glow of my laptop and the faint sounds through the wall. Their laughter bled through, too loud, too certain, as if the world belonged to them. My hand moved steadily as I adjusted the camera, sliding it into place through the service hallway that connected the rooms. The tiny lens captured everything, every touch, every careless word, every arrogant whisper. I sat listening, not with grief, but with a strange calm, watching the images stream clearly across the screen. For the first time in months, I felt control return to me. When the recording ended, I didn't linger. I saved the files carefully, backed them up under names that would mean nothing to anyone else, and closed the laptop with a steady hand. The next morning, I smiled at Andrew over breakfast, as though nothing had changed. He spoke about deadlines and market trends while sipping his coffee, unaware that his world had already begun to unravel. The footage was my proof, my insurance, and my weapon. But I knew proof alone was not enough. Timing would matter more than anything, and I would choose my moment carefully. In the days that followed, I tested smaller cracks in their foundation. I sent an anonymous message to Andrew's company tip line mentioning improper conduct during a recent business trip. I mailed a single screenshot of Tessa's text to Mark, without a note, just enough to stir unease. I watched closely, but neither of them confronted me. They carried on, unaware that the ground beneath them was beginning to shift. Each step I took was deliberate, each move designed to build pressure without breaking the silence too soon. Their downfall had to come from within their own pride, and I was patient enough to wait. At home, Andrew carried himself with the same smugness that had once broken me. He sprawled on the couch, his tie loosened, his phone face down, as if that small gesture could keep me from the truth. I cooked dinner, poured wine, and matched his small talk with practiced ease. Every glance, every touch was another layer to the mask I wore, and he believed it completely. The irony was sharp. I had never been more present, more aware, and yet he thought I was blind. I let him think it, savoring the advantage it gave me. Tessa, too, continued her charade. She called me sister with warmth that now felt like poison, invited me to lunches, and laughed with the same practiced ease she had always carried. I accepted her invitations, listened to her carefully, and smiled at all the right moments. But beneath the table, my hands stayed folded tight in my lap, grounding me against the urge to reveal what I knew. She believed her mask was flawless. I let her believe it, knowing that when it finally cracked, the fall would be far greater. One evening, while Andrew showered, I opened my notebook and flipped through its pages. Dates, times, receipts, messages, all of it lay before me like a map of betrayal. At the end, I added a new line. The trap is set, they will not see it coming. Closing the book, I felt calm rather than restless. For months, I had carried grief, then rage, but now what I carried was clarity. Their arrogance had given me everything I needed. My silence had become my strongest weapon, and I was prepared to wield it with precision. The moment was not yet right for full exposure, but I knew it was approaching. I could feel it in the way Andrew's lies grew lazier, in the way Tessa's confidence bloomed unchecked. They were digging themselves deeper without realizing it, and all I had to do was let them. Soon, their pride would be the very thing that delivered them into the open, and when that moment came, I would be ready. I set down the pen, turned off the light, and listened to the water run in the bathroom. The house was quiet, but inside me, the certainty was louder than ever. Their end had already begun. I was simply waiting for the right moment to let the world see it. The night I chose to expose them arrived like any other, quiet at first glance, but carrying a charge beneath the surface. Andrew believed he was heading to a routine conference in Cambridge. He dressed sharply, his tie neat, his briefcase polished. Tessa followed minutes later, wearing that same red coat I once admired, her heels striking the sidewalk with confidence. They thought they were walking into their sanctuary, the place they could shed their disguises. What they didn't know was that every step carried them closer to their ruin. I had booked the room next to theirs again, checking in early so I could prepare without rushing. The hotel's hallways were lined with muted artwork and soft lamps that did little to hide the sterility of the place. From my seat near the bar in the lobby, I watched them kiss, bold now, in a public space where strangers' eyes didn't matter. I sipped my drink calmly, my face hidden behind the rim of the glass, as they moved toward the elevators. No one looked twice at me. Once they disappeared upstairs, I followed quietly, slipping into my room and opening my laptop. The small camera I had planted earlier came to life, its feed sharp and unyielding. There they were, tangled in each other's arms, laughing, unaware that every second was being captured. I didn't linger on the images. I had seen enough of their betrayal to last me a lifetime. Instead, I cued the footage, trimming it carefully, ensuring it would speak clearly without the need for explanation. I wanted no doubt, no way for them to twist it into half-truths. I selected the moments that revealed intimacy. The words that carried promises they had no right to make the kind of evidence that left no room for denial. The file was short, deliberate, and impossible to dispute. When it was ready, I leaned back, listening to the muted sound of their voices through the wall, and felt the calm certainty of someone who had waited long enough. Downstairs, the hotel ballroom was filling with guests. Andrew's company was hosting its quarterly dinner, an event filled with executives, clients, and colleagues whose respect meant everything to him. It was a night he couldn't afford to miss, yet he was upstairs with Tessa, indulging in the very arrogance that would destroy him. I slipped into the back of the ballroom, blending into the crowd, as waiters moved gracefully between tables. The screen at the front of the room glowed with a company logo, ready for the evening's presentation. I opened my phone, attached the file, and sent it directly to the projectionist with a note that made it appear official. My hands didn't shake. My breath stayed steady. All I felt was inevitability. At 8:45, the lights dimmed slightly as the presentation began. Executives spoke at the podium, their voices smooth and practiced. Glasses clinked, polite laughter rippled, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Then the screen flickered. At first it seemed like a technical glitch, but within seconds the ballroom was silent. The image sharpened, and Tessa's laugh spilled through the speakers. It was followed by Andrew's voice, unmistakable and intimate. Gasps broke the silence as faces turned toward the screen, confusion giving way to shock. On the screen, Andrew appeared, with Tessa, his hands on her lips pressed to his. Their whispers played over the sound system, carrying across every table. The room erupted into whispers, forks frozen halfway to plates, glasses set down with trembling hands. Andrew sat stiffly at one of the front tables, his face draining of color as recognition spread. He stammered, his lips moving without words, while colleagues stared openly, no longer polite, no longer pretending. His boss, a man known for his stern composure, stood abruptly, his jaw set, his gaze sharp as glass. "Mr. Mercer," he said into the silence, his voice heavy with restrained anger. "We need to speak." The words carried enough weight to crush what little dignity Andrew had left. Tessa, seated just behind him, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide, as her own laughter echoed around the room. She rose quickly, excusing herself in a flurry of whispers and fabric, but she wasn't fast enough to escape the hallway outside. Mark stood waiting near the elevators, holding an envelope I had sent him days before. His expression was cold, his voice steady enough to carry. "Don't come home," he said, dropping the envelope at her feet before walking away. Guests who had followed out into the hallway saw it all, their murmurs rising as Tessa collapsed against the wall, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Back in the ballroom, Andrew's colleagues were already turning away their conversations, shifting into hurried whispers, their trust dissolving in front of him. His boss leaned close, speaking words I couldn't hear, but I knew their meaning. Suspension, disgrace, the end of everything he had built. Andrew's hand trembled as he tried to reach for his glass. His tie loosened, his composure gone. No one offered him comfort. The empire of respect he had lived on was disintegrating, and he was left to crumble in front of them all. I stood at the back, unseen, watching the chaos unfold with the calm of someone who had waited long enough. When I stepped out of the ballroom, the hallway was quieter. Tessa sat slumped against the wall, her red coat puddled around her, her hands shaking as she clutched at her face. I didn't stop. I walked past her, steady, the click of my heels the only sound. She didn't look up, and I didn't offer her the comfort she had never deserved. Outside, the cold night air hit me crisp and clear, carrying away the echoes of their downfall. I pulled my coat tighter, the weight of the flash drive in my pocket, reminding me of the final steps still to come. Later that night, Andrew returned home, his tie undone, his face gray and hollow. He found me in the living room, sitting calmly with a glass of wine beside a stack of papers laid neatly on the coffee table. Divorce filings, financial freezes, and transfer documents waited for his signature. He staggered forward, his voice broken. "Elaine, I can explain." I met his eyes steady and said softly, "You already did." His gaze fell to the papers, his lips moving as if searching for excuses, but none came. I reached into my pocket and set the flash drive between us, its metallic click echoing in the silence. "This is everything I told him," my voice quiet but firm. "Every word, every moment. It's already been sent where it needed to go. You can't erase it. You can't bury it." He sank into a chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the wreckage of his life laid out in front of him. For the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes, the realization that he had not only lost me, but everything he thought made him powerful. I leaned forward, my words sharp, but even. "You thought I was naive. You thought I would never see. But I've been watching, Andrew. Every lie, every betrayal. And now it's your turn to live with it." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever shared. He sat, hunched, his shoulders bowed, unable to meet my eyes. I stood collecting my glass and left him there in the dim light of the living room. Behind me, the quiet seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. For me, there was no triumph, only the steadiness of justice, long overdue. And as I climbed the stairs, the weight of what came next settled firmly. The exposure had begun, but the full reckoning was still to come. The days after the ballroom felt like walking through the wreckage of a storm. The world outside moved on. Traffic hummed, stores opened, children laughed on their way to school. But inside our house, silence had a different weight. Andrew sat for hours at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped, papers scattered in front of him. His phone buzzed less and less. The once constant stream of colleagues and clients had slowed to nothing, replaced by an emptiness that he couldn't explain away. He looked at me sometimes, as though searching for familiarity, but there was nothing left for me to give him. The board at his firm suspended him within days. The footage had spread farther than either of us could have imagined, leaked beyond the walls of the hotel ballroom into offices across the city and then beyond. His name was whispered in circles that used to welcome him, his reputation crumbling in places he had once been admired. I didn't need to press harder. The world was doing the work for me. At home, he tried to argue when I moved forward with the divorce. He shouted one night, his tie hanging loose around his neck, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "You can't take everything from me," he said, his fist slamming against the table. I stood in the doorway, arms folded, my voice even. "I didn't take it, Andrew. You gave it away." The proceedings moved quickly, helped by the weight of evidence I had carefully built. Each photograph, each receipt, each recording stood as a wall he couldn't climb. His lawyer, once confident, began to falter as the scope of his betrayal was laid out in orderly lines of proof. The house, the accounts, the assets all shifted into my hands with a speed that stunned even me. He signed papers with trembling hands, each stroke of his pen another surrender. Watching him break was not joyful. It was simply necessary. Tessa's life collapsed just as swiftly. Mark filed for separation. Within a week, the screenshots I had sent him undeniable. He moved out quietly, taking their children to stay with his parents in the suburbs. Tessa's calls began soon after, her voice thick with tears that filled my voicemail. "Elaine, please. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I never meant to hurt you." I listened once, long enough to hear her sobs, and then I deleted each one after. I had no interest in her remorse. The last time I heard about her, she had been seen in Cambridge, her once polished appearance reduced to disarray, asking old colleagues for help they couldn't give. The red coat she wore with such pride had lost its brilliance. The same woman who once stood beside me at family dinners now stumbled alone. Her name whispered with pity rather than admiration. At night, I sometimes sat with a glass of wine in the living room, the papers from the divorce stacked neatly on the table. Andrew drifted through the house like a shadow, his confidence stripped away. He tried once more to reason with me, his voice softer this time, almost pleading. "Elaine, if you'd just left, if you'd walked away, none of this." His words faltered when he saw my expression. I leaned forward, quiet but steady. "You planned it with her. You laughed at me. You called me naive. I didn't walk away because you made sure there was nothing left worth saving." His face paled, the memory of those words hitting him again the night at the hotel, when he thought I would never hear. There was still one truth I hadn't spoken aloud. I waited until the final signing, when the last document was placed in front of him in a sterile office filled with polished wood and quiet tension. He signed his name, his hand shaking slightly, and then he looked at me. "Why?" His voice cracked, carrying both anger and despair. "Why destroy me like this, when you could have just left?" I let the silence stretch, watching him shift uneasily before I slid a folded paper across the table. He opened it slowly, his eyes darting back and forth across the page, confusion curdling into horror. It wasn't another receipt. It was a paternity test. His lips parted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "Tessa's youngest daughter. The one you joked didn't look like Mark. She's yours, and I've known for months." The color drained from his face. His lawyer glanced at him sharply, the weight of the revelation sinking into the room like a stone. I stood, gathering my bag, my voice calm. "You didn't just betray me once, Andrew. You built another life on lies. And now, everyone will know." I left him there frozen, the paper trembling in his hands. In the weeks that followed, the whispers spread. It wasn't only an affair anymore. It was blood. It was family. The revelation rippled through his circles, leaving nothing untouched. The firm cut all ties. Friends vanished. Tessa's marriage was gone. Her reputation finished, her children shielded from her by the man she had once betrayed. For Andrew, it was worse. The father he had idolized, the siblings he had boasted to all, turned their faces away. The shame was no longer confined to hotel rooms or office corridors. It was everywhere. I didn't revel in their downfall. I carried myself with the same steadiness I had built during those long months of planning. The house was mine, the accounts secured, and for the first time in years, I felt a quiet peace in my own home. Each room seemed lighter without the weight of his lies pressing against the walls. I slept without waking in the night, without listening for footsteps or messages that didn't belong. Justice had been delivered and dignity restored. But even in the calm, I knew the story wasn't finished. The divorce was final, their reputation shattered, but one truth remained etched in me. Their betrayal had not just been about infidelity. It had been about arrogance, about believing I would never see, never rise. And as I stood in the kitchen one morning, sunlight streaming through the window onto the same table where Andrew once smirked through lies, I realized the final step was not just about what I had taken back. It was about what I had reclaimed within myself. And though their worlds had collapsed, mine was still being rebuilt. The last word had not yet been spoken. When the last papers were signed and the silence finally settled, I realized how much lighter the house felt. The rooms that once carried the weight of Andrew's lies now belonged only to me. The quiet no longer pressed in like a burden. It felt steady, almost comforting, like a long breath I hadn't taken in years. I walked from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the little pieces of life I had once built with him, and for the first time, I felt they were mine again. Andrew's world never recovered. The firm let him go, and his name carried more whispers than respect. Even his family, the ones who once looked at me with polite dismissal, turned their eyes away from him when the truth could no longer be denied. Tessa drifted further into the background, her marriage gone, her reputation undone. She had been my closest friend once, but the woman I knew no longer existed. She was only the shadow of choices she couldn't take back. Mark rebuilt his life quietly, raising his children with the steadiness of someone who had no patience left for lies. I never spoke with him directly after that night, but I heard through neighbors that he carried himself with dignity, focused on what mattered most. Ethan, the friend who had helped me when I needed a steady hand, never asked for details, and I never offered them. Some people come into a story just long enough to give you the tools to move forward, and that is enough. As for me, I chose not to linger on the wreckage. Justice had been served, but victory was not about what I had taken from them. It was about what I had reclaimed in myself. My trust had been broken, but my dignity remained. I had walked through the darkest kind of betrayal and come out not with bitterness, but with clarity. The woman they thought was naive had been watching all along, and in the end, she was the one who stood tall. Life did not suddenly become perfect, but it became honest. I learned to take joy in smaller things again. Quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, evenings on the porch, with a book in my hands, the sound of laughter from students in the hallway at school. Each of those moments felt like proof that healing doesn't come in grand gestures, but in steady breaths, day after day. I no longer needed their approval, their loyalty, or their presence. I had learned the hardest lesson, that peace is found not in being chosen, but in choosing yourself. Looking back now, I see the betrayal not only for what it took from me, but for what it taught me. It stripped away illusions I should have let go of long ago. It showed me the strength I never knew I had. And most of all, it reminded me that even when others mock you or dismiss you, your silence can be your greatest power until the moment you decide to speak with action instead of words. So that is where my story ends, not with sorrow, but with steadiness. Andrew and Tessa live with the wreckage they created, while I carry forward with a life restored. I do not forgive them, but I no longer carry them either. My dignity is intact, my peace reclaimed, and my future entirely my own. Before we close, I'd love to know if you've walked through betrayal, what carried you back to yourself. Share your thoughts if you wish, and thank you for listening to my story.